I think that a lot of people think DEI is just about feelings, but there are hard metrics and accountability, mutual accountability structures where you can collect data. And one of them is profit.
Exude Human Capital hosts Hold On, Let Me Close My Door, bringing real HR stories from real professionals with real solutions to you. Join us as we navigate the ever-changing workplace with Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner, Exude Human Capital, and special guests.
Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I'm Allison DeFlorio, and I'm so honored to have with me today one of our senior consultants and one of our facilitators of many of our diversity, equity, inclusion programs, Romaine Jones-Wise. Hi, Ro.
Hi, Allison. Happy to be here. Looking forward to today's conversation.
I am too. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of your insights based on the work that you've been doing with our clients. We are also so honored to have with us today as our guest, Coach Dora Mendez. Welcome, Dora.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for our DEI gets the side eye conversation.
Yes, DEI gets the side eye. That's the name of today's episode. And I'm sure if you're listening to this conversation today, you're no stranger to the what's been in the news and what's been happening and how some of the actions taken by the current administration are are resulting in organizations thinking about how they approach diversity, equity, inclusion in their organizations. We hope to share insights from Coach Dora's experience and our experience in working with clients through Exude Human Capital, and hopefully leave you with some insights and tips on how you can continue to drive inclusion and belonging in your workplaces. Uh, Before we get started, I want to formally introduce our guest, Coach Dora. Coach Dora, I had the pleasure of meeting as we sat on a panel in New York City for a group of philanthropic organizations, and learned about her practice and learned about the work she does. In addition to being the founder of Coach Dora LLC, she is a professor at the City University of New York, the John Jay College. She is an HR professional, has just such an interesting background. And I'll let Coach Dora share a little bit more about your experience in this space.
Thanks, Allison and Ro for inviting me. Yeah, so my mission at Coach Dora is to be a beacon of bold authenticity, igniting conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI through my writing and public speaking. I envision a world where everyone feels empowered to lead with courage and compassion, and my coaching and consulting services are the tools to make that vision a reality. And before I started the business, I was 12 years as a C-suite and senior executive in human resources. I my last role was as vice president of human resources and chief diversity and equity officer at a philanthropic organization. And before my HR career, I was in law enforcement. I investigated discrimination cases in employment and housing, and my last role was working in the Office of Sexual Harassment Issues in the New York State Division of Human Rights. So my whole career has been about justice and equity and supporting people, culture, DEI was just a nat. I've been doing DEI work since forever, but even before it became sort of this acronym and buzzword and lightning word, I've been enriching the culture and supporting people for a really long time. So thanks for this opportunity to have this conversation in the political context that we are in right now.
Great. And we're so happy to have you. Thank you for joining us as well. Just to set some context for the conversation, and I don't think that this is new to anyone listening, but certainly in the last few months, as the new administration has signed a number of executive actions, executive orders that have uh, required organizations to remove references to diversity, equity, and inclusion, uh, or run the risk of potentially being denied funding or perhaps not being awarded contracts. So, regardless of whether you're in the nonprofit space or the for profit space, some of these executive orders can impact or will place your organization under scrutiny. That said, we have been talking with a number of leaders who feel very strongly and passionately about ensuring that they lead their organizations through that lens of inclusion and that they create spaces for people to be their authentic selves and to add value to the organization. We know statistically that diverse, inclusive organizations show higher levels of profitability, higher levels of engagement, and higher levels of cross-departmental innovation. Um, so I want to hopefully walk through some questions with you, Dora and Ro, to help our listeners think about how, as an organization, if you really want to continue to drive that inclusive environment, can you do so in compliance with the executive orders and in a way that protects your organization, but also protects the people in your organization to be able to do the great work that you want them to do. So, what do you think, Dora, about the changes, at least in what you've seen, changes that businesses or nonprofits are making in response to some of these executive orders?
So first, I think it's really important, Allison, to not over correct because these executive orders don't for non-governmental organizations don't trump the actual law.
Mhm.
I mean, anti-discrimination laws still exist. There are laws, the Constitution, there are laws that are on the books, even laws that require certain funding. So, for example, the American with Disabilities Act requires the government to fund special education. It is in the law. You have to, the government must fund special education in public schools. And that's just one example. So there are laws on the books, and my concern is always to tell people to slow down and not like overcorrect based on something that's in the news or in an executive order because the executive orders only impact government organizations, and they can only suggest how the government organizations will make decisions. So I just the first thing I want to tell people is not to overreact, to take a breath and remember that compliance, the law still, you know, we still need to follow the law.
And I think that's sound advice, Ro. I know that that's kind of the approach that you have been sharing with the groups that we work with. Do you want to share any insights there?
Just, to remind people that we still need to kind of forge ahead. Like this doesn't change the momentum that we have and the work that you're already doing and the intentionality that a lot of organizations have put into this work even prior to the label and now with what may become neutralizing language or changing how it's worded on their website or in their employee manual, but just being intentional about the work forward and helping with the growth mindset and the sense of belonging and understanding that everyone brings value. And I think that's the part that we stepped away from. There is a a benefit to having diversity in the workplace and in the world in general, because we all have different experiences. We all have different insights. We can come to a conversation and offer different perspectives, which helps us all become better in the long run because now I've learned something. I'm growing, I'm maturing, I'm seeing things from a different perspective. So I think it's about forging ahead and continuing the work that we do. And whatever you call it, but we're still going to do the work.
I
That
appreciate that. And I'm gonna tap into both of your HR expertise now in asking, you know, if you think about the processes that and the policies that organizations have in place today, Dora, to your point, laws have not changed. How can companies, organizations stay compliant and also adjust for these executive orders?
I think the pivot is in the language and communication, because if you have a an organization or a company that has embedded diversity, equity, inclusion in their practice, in their policies, then it doesn't matter what you call it. It's already part of DEI is not something that they do, it's the way they do things. So if it's already embedded in your policies and your practices, and there's a good foundation, and it's not just a check box, then I think those organizations and those companies really don't have to worry, because they just have to then deal with just semantics, because it's already the way they're working. It's the organizations that were superficial about it, and we all know that there are organizations that really weren't authentically bought in, so it's easy for them to abandon because they weren't even really doing it in the first place.
Mhm.
So for the organizations that truly believe in resilience and respect in the workplace, because that's really what, this show isn't about defining what DEI is. Your audience is more sophisticated. But when we think about a workplace that brings out the best in people, resilience, respect, those are the values that you want to stick with. Those are the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it's pivoting to uh, speak about inclusion, making inclusion primary, uplifting people of all identities, uplifting people of all skill sets. Um, uh, you can continue to do that. And I think the pivot is really with language. Um, and I think about Costco, and in some cases, there are some companies like Costco where they doubled down on DEI and saying it out loud, and people thought they were crazy and they were going to get hurt, but they haven't, because they're a grocery store, and who's suffering? Who's suffering? And they're doing better business than ever. They're doing better business than ever because they're affordable. They're reaching out to people in their communities. They have employees and that represent the communities that they serve. These are the working people in the community, and it's inclusive of everyone. And people are going to Costco in droves because that's how you save money in this in in account about. So I think of a company like Costco who has just like dug in deep, and said, we're not changing anything. People thought, oh my God, you're crazy, you're challenging. And they're not, because people need affordable groceries. Um,
It's interesting you say that because you make me think uh, of something Ro and I shared with a group yesterday. It's that clarity of your commitment and the consistency with which you carry out that commitment. You use Costco, which is a perfect example. It's embedded into their culture. And therefore, they can say with confidence they are continuing down this path. You look at uh, an organization, and I don't mean to call out organizations specifically, but Target rolled out, the commitment to DEI, but rolled it back in response, and there was an economic impact to Target. And that's it's interesting that your actions as leader during these times can really impact the business. Ro, I wanted to ask you about something Dora mentioned too, is, if it's embedded in your culture, like what are some of the things where it will be embedded? So if you are asked or challenged, that you can share, or you can prove, if you will, that this is the way we do our work.
If organizations have fully integrated inclusion into the fabric of their organizations, then it will show up in things like their hiring practices, their performance management strategies, who's being promoted, how are you supporting or how are you supporting and or defining your high potential staff and giving them opportunity. What does career pathing look like? Are there barriers to career development? So, and I am a big fan of data. I love numbers. You know me, Allison. You know I love numbers.
Mhm.
But making sure that things are happening based off of data in the system, not people making impulsive um, decisions or going with their gut reaction. And I think it's also important, and you talk about leadership, that leaders are fully equipped to be inclusive leaders, and that it's getting beyond the physical things that we think we see when we look at one another, but also equipping leaders to be able to support the invisible diverse traits that we all have, that you won't know until we spark conversation, that you won't know until we fully engage with one another. Case in point, Allison, you know this. I'm dyslexic. You wouldn't look at me to know that I am dyslexic. However, you know that in our communications, it's always helpful for you to send me questions up front so I have time to process and generate and things like that. But that is because we have established that connection, we have that rapport, and that there's that safety that I have with you, that I could divulge that because I haven't done that with previous employers because I didn't feel safe to do so. So even in that regard, creating that belonging and psychological safety, and ensuring that there's accountability in addition to empathetic leadership and compassion, but there's some level of accountability that people are going to be held responsible for their actions, be them positive or constructive, that there's some kind of measure of accountability within organizations as well. Inclusion isn't illegal. Let's just say it. It's not illegal.
Can I just add something about the data piece?
Mhm.
I think that a lot of people think DEI is just about feelings, but there are hard metrics, and accountability, mutual accountability, structures, where you can collect data, and one of them is profit. And so I think people think that by supporting staff and, I hear this argument because you mentioned uh, hiring structure, and one of the sort of best practices in DEI is blind resumes. And there's all this talk about meritocracy. And one of the things that a blind resume does is that you're just looking at the qualifications. You don't know the gender of the person. You don't know what school they went to. And women and people of color, because of the historic structural barriers for their success, are overeducated. Often we overeducate ourselves to protect ourselves from that. So when you look at blind resumes, you will see master's degrees and certifications for women and people of color because they know they need to arm themselves with more educations and certificates so that they can raise those barriers, while others may not have as much um, education or certifications because they've relied on their network or their school or their relationships to get a foot in the door. And so when you blind resumes is when you talk about merit, that is DEI is creates a environment where you can judge people on their qualifications, their skills, and their merit. And we have found it's not surprising that the Department of Education is being targeted because women, people of color, people with disabilities now are advancing through the educational system a lot faster and higher because of DEI best practices, um, because we're investing in closing gaps in wages and closing gaps in skills for people who traditionally didn't have those opportunities. So it's not surprising to me that, the dismantling of, one of the executive orders is to dismantle education because that's where women, people of color, and people with disabilities are. That's the institution that is helping to advance those groups. Those traditional groups have been shut out of advancement.
Yeah.
And so and that's one of the things that DEI has done, which is created a more even playing field for meritocracy to happen.
And I think about it too, we spoke at the beginning of this podcast about the data on the benefits of having a diverse workplace. And I think about having the insights that a diverse population that is reflective of the community or the individuals you serve, whether you call them clients, guests, patients, whatever, when making product decisions or service options, to have around the table a representation of individuals that reflect those who are going to be the recipients of your product or your service. Or so I want to ask, what are the risks if businesses cut back on efforts around diversity and inclusion?
Attrition. People will leave um, on their own. I know there's a lot of people getting fired now
Mm.
um, and laid off, but people will leave because it's a value that a lot of people, there'll be a brain drain really from your organization. But that being said, I don't want to be naive either. There are organizations that do get federal funding and that have federal contracts, and really they are really concerned that the decision makers, um, even though things are required by law, that the decision makers will frustrate the process. And we've seen that already happen, like with quote unquote computer glitches. To the Medicaid system, there was a computer glitch for a whole week, and a whole bunch of organizations didn't get paid. Or it was a computer glitch. But and it just sent a big signal, like, here's what could happen to you if you don't align with our values. So I'm not naive, and I work in academia as well. So they're having these conversations. I work at a Hispanic serving institution. 40% of the students are uh, identify as Latino, Latinx, and that's a that designation is a very proud one that we have in the organization. It's helped us to really customize the education of our students, and you know we get lots of federal funding for that. And so I'm not naive. Like, even though the law says that they have to fund certain things, the administration can clearly frustrate the processes, delay things, and just frustrate and make life difficult for people. So I'm not naive about that.
Yeah.
So finding the right balance on staying the course without losing the gains that you've made with inclusion is tricky. Um, and so I don't want to people to leave here like, oh, don't forget about all the noise and just, keep staying the course. There has to be some just I just there has to be a way to pivot without losing the goals and the gains that you have made.
Mm.
And people are partnering. I'm noticing that people are coming more into community, like organizations and groups that were competitors are now getting together and say, hey, you know we all might lose this grant, so why don't we just get together and figure out how to pivot and all, and put I'm noticing more community, so more people coming together actually, and more inclusion on coming together on strategies to how to pivot to navigate these times and make sure that we stay true to our values, but also don't lose out, um, you know, on opportunities,
Mhm.
because of these times. So, I wish I could all be rah, 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 positive, stay the course 100% hunkered down. We're not all Costco's. Um, but at the end of the day, I'm not naive about it, but there has to be in partnership a very strategic way to stay true to your values and navigate these new systems.
I almost think too, in hearing your response, those organizations that have a strategy, that they're following the strategy, uh, will will have something to work toward, so that in to your point, not abandoning what you've already have done, but how do you thoughtfully, intentionally continue to do the work that matters to your business, knowing every business is different and every business is going to have to make some decisions. In thinking about that, this is a tough time for business leaders, for nonprofit leaders, and they're having conversations with people whose perspectives may differ from their own. And I'm curious to hear from you, both of you, um, what you think about that. How should leaders talk to people, or what advice do you have for leaders when talking to people whose perspectives around DEI may be different from theirs?
I encourage people to lean into the conversation with curiosity and not combativeness. You don't have to get the person to agree with you. It's okay that we disagree. That is totally fine. But we need to lean into these conversations with the mindset to learn, gain perspective, not defend our stance. Because if you go into a conversation where someone has a different view on DEI, then you're going in just trying to prove that you're right. And that's not really going to get us very far. If there's a way to come together, and even with disagreement, we don't have to be disrespectful, if that makes sense. Like, disagreement doesn't have to yield disrespect. We can agree to disagree, but at least if I come into the conversation with a curiosity, I'm still coming away with an understanding or a different perspective. You may not change my mind, I may not change yours, but we've at least had a civil conversation, and now I'm looking at it a different way. So I think just kind of approaching the conversations with curiosity and not being automatically on the defensive.
I, I,
Dora, what do you think?
I like when you say curiosity. My trick has always been, even before times, there's always going to be people that disagree on a whole bunch of issues. Like, there's always been people who believe racism doesn't exist. There's always been people who believe sexism doesn't always exist. Even before these times, there's always been people who believe, that there aren't structural barriers or systemic barriers. And I like the curiosity. Just ask questions. I asked a lot of questions, and I will give an example about ageism. Um, that kind of feels like neutral in these days, but like I remember working with a hiring manager uh who did not want to hire a young man for a role. And this was an intergenerational issue, and I couldn't be a party. I could see that this was clearly just a bias, and I didn't want to be a party to that. So I just kept asking questions like, why don't you think? Like, why don't like, but I don't understand. Did you hear his response to this? Did you read the thing? Like, I just kept asking questions and asking questions, and as the person kept answering the questions, I think they were realizing like there really was no like real reason to reject this candidate. Just by asking a lot of questions, and I didn't wanna accuse them of being biased or being ageist, and this was, you know, a a boomer versus a millennial, and it was, and I just really just asked a lot of questions, just asked a lot of questions, and it helped the person realize, like, "Okay, I really don't have, a really solid reason to reject this person." And so that's how I knew they weren't it was a way to do it without being accusatory or judgmental. It was just like leading with that curiosity. So, I wanted to just share like a concrete example of how that curiosity helped, like, just bring asking a lot of questions about, but why? I don't understand. Did you see this? Like, tell me more, explain, and having like helping the person kind of confront their own, biases without them like in a subtle way. Um, and it was a way for me not to say, you're just being totally, ageist, and you're gonna get a suit, and instead of like taking a hard line and saying as the HR, gonna just make the decision because you're gonna get a suit. I just asked those questions, and the person comes to realize that there really was no reason for, um, not accepting this person into our community. And so that's the leading with curiosity is a great tool, but that's just a practical way to like kind of do it without being confrontational.
And
You know,
it's
I'm like, oh,
oh,
go ahead, Ro.
I was gonna say, and it's funny, I recently did a training for one of our clients on managing multiple generations. And part of that conversation was dispelling the myths and stereotypes that we put on the different generations and how you leverage the strengths of all of the people. So even if we look at it, talking about people making ageist hiring practices, there's opportunity for us to find the strength in all of our differences. And at the end of that training, I had some leaders, inbox me and go, I would have never thought to pair my boomers and my millennials together because I thought it would be friction. But if you complement them and show the strengths of the others, it works out well for everybody. I think the same is true if we look at this on the larger scale of the visible and invisible um, diverse dimensions that we all have. When we can complement the differences, it works. It really does. And I could harp on this all day, so I'll stop because I'll ramble on. But it really is just about understanding the differences make us better. And it's okay to be different. I'm totally fine with that. And I stand 10 toes on that.
Okay, so it sounds to me, and both of you are passionate around the value of inclusion in the workplace and passionate around uh, regardless of the current situation, that organization should stay the course, is what I'm hearing you say, and that staying the course, it aligns to your values, to the mission of the organization, to the goal of the organization, the work of the organization. What best pieces of advice do you have for leaders of organizations, of companies, for profit or nonprofit, who want to stay the course, to future proof their DEI efforts and continue to build on the work that they have been doing, so that they can remain inclusive workplaces? Dora?
Um, I would say just take your time, slow down, don't overcorrect, and reach out to a professional like me. No, to help you do that. You may need some neutral eyes, people coming in to help you with that. So that's what I would say. Just slow down, um, be transparent about why you're looking at certain policies and procedures. And yeah, that's it. Just slow down, be transparent, and don't overcorrect.
That's great. Ro, any final thoughts?
I think it's about making sure that the strategy is there, but the strategy also has some adaptability and agility built into it. So as you need to pivot, you can, but still holding true to the mission. And I think a big component of that is making sure you listen to your employees. If that's by way of engagement surveys, if that's by way of stay interviews, if that's like town halls or forums, listen, find out what's really going on. Don't assume that you know, and then make sure your leaders are equipped to have inclusive practices, not just in a quarterly training, but in day to day operations to make sure that the culture of the organization is holding true to the mission so that what you're performing on the outside also matches what you're doing on the inside.
Dora and Ro, this has been an honor to have the conversation with you, and I could go on for days, I think, talking about this topic. But I want to thank both of you, and I just want to thank Dora in particular for being our special guest today. Just as a reminder, Coach Dora LLC. Dora is based out of New York City, and we're just grateful that you spent time with us on Hold On, Let Me Close My Door today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to hear the episode. I can't wait to share it with people. And I think people will, a lot of people are having these conversations. I think it's going to help reassure, help people feel good about the course of action they're taking.
Yeah, and we want to leave you with a quote that one of our colleagues found that we thought really speaks to this topic, and it's unknown who wrote this quote, but it's inclusion isn't just inviting someone to sit at your table; it's believing they belong there. And with that, I thank all of you for listening to Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. Until next time.